Oi, pessoal, boa noite. Nossa, é um prazer estarmos aqui hoje com a Maia, e isso já é uma iniciativa que a gente está tentando, né, implementar há algum tempo, mas acho que o momento não podia ser melhor, até porque vocês viram que recentemente teve até um evento falando sobre a nova ISO de língua de sinais que está sendo proposta. Então, muito importante a gente estar valorizando esses colegas, o trabalho desses colegas. O Tiago sempre trouxe para nós essa possibilidade. O Tiago e todos que vieram para a APIC, entraram na APIC nos últimos 2, 3 anos, que foi uma massa significativa. É importante sinalizar que na AIIC Brasil e na AIIC não temos Libras ainda. Temos línguas de sinais, mas ainda não temos Libras. Então, é muito bom poder receber a Maia aqui hoje para falar com colegas da AIIC e da APIC. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. A Maia vai fazer mais ou menos uma meia hora de apresentação e a gente vai gravar, como vocês viram, a gente está gravando a apresentação. Depois a gente vai parar a gravação e ela vai continuar com os debates. Célia, você quer, por favor, falar alguma coisa? Fica à
Não,
vontade.
só agradecer a todo mundo que está aqui com a gente, agradecer a todos os nossos intérpretes de Libras queridos que estão aqui, com os quais eu me sinto próxima, de certa forma, por ter o Tiago tão próximo assim, tão dedicado e incrível em tudo que ele faz. Muito obrigada por viabilizar isso tudo, Tiago. E obrigada a todos. Vamos lá ouvir o que a gente tem para ouvir, para aprender hoje aqui. Thank you, Maya, for being with us.
Ó, ótima a sua dica, Célia. Eu
Uhum.
tenho que agradecer a Andréa Negreda e Dani Fonseca, que estão aqui com a gente interpretando para o português e inglês, e a Carol Fomin e o Tiago Coimbra, que vão interpretar Libras, tá? Então, vamos em frente. Maia, por favor. Maia, please, you have the floor and you can introduce yourself, although most people here already know who you are. So thank you very much.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm just very thrilled, honored. I mean, just excited to be here. And a very, very big thank you to APIC and AIIC for inviting me. I wanted also to thank the interpreters because I know it's always a challenge to interpret another interpreter. So thank you for doing that. Sorry, I don't speak Portuguese. I have to say it because, I always like to address my audience in their language, but unfortunately, I don't have any longer Portuguese. I'll show you. I'll share my slides. Let's see. Can you let me know if you can see it? Yes, you can see it. Great. All right. So here's the title of my presentation: Mixing It Up. Conference Signed and Spoken Language Interpreters Collaborative Practices. And just to give you a little bit of my background, I have never done only one thing. So I've always combined my professional life in different capacities. So I'm an interpreter, I'm a trainer, a researcher, a consultant, and I have over 30 years of experience in this capacity. What I also do is I try to interact with what I do. So in my interpreting practices, I use what I find in my research. I use in my training. I use that as a consultant interpreter. So it's really a nice opportunity to bring everything together in what I do. I'm based in the Netherlands. I moved around during my life, but most of my time I spent in the Netherlands, where my family is most of the time. Half of my family is German, so I have German and Dutch as my mother tongue. Good to know. I think this is something that, interpreters do a lot, is say, which languages do you work with? So I work with 3 spoken languages and 3 signed languages, and always a combination with a spoken and a signed language. So I have English and Dutch and German, and on the other hand, I have Dutch Sign Language, which is abbreviated as NGT, ASL, American Sign Language, and International Sign. So those are the languages that I work with. I'm also a member of several organizations. As you know, I'm a member of AIIC, and I was actually the first sign language interpreter that joined AIIC in 2014. So this is exactly my 10-year anniversary. So I'm happy to celebrate that with you. So that's really exciting. I'm also accredited by different organizations. So I'm also accredited by the Dutch Association of Sign Language Interpreters. I have various degrees, working up from a bachelor to recently a PhD. And I'm also accredited by many different international institutions as a conference interpreter. So for example, in the United Nations and the European Union, but also the Council of Europe. So many exciting things that I'm involved with. Let me just go to the next slide. So just a little trip back in memory lane. I don't know if some of you might recognize some of these because these are all pictures from Brazil. So one of the moments in my life, I was lucky enough to make it to your beautiful country. And I loved it. I thought it was amazing. I never wanted to leave again, but my dad's job made us move back to the Netherlands. And you can actually see on the left side, you can see us walking over the hanging bridge of Setchiqueiras, which I know is no longer there. And then you have Salvador and Brasilia with my brother and my little sister. And I wanted to share that I love your country, and I hope one day I'll make it back in person and see you all instead of via a screen. So this is what I already explained to you, that I have different rules. And I wanted to share this picture on the right with you because I think it's spectacular. It's actually one of the ceilings of the United Nations building in Geneva, where the Human Rights Council always meets. And one of the things that they now have in place is the sign that it's reserved for sign language interpreters to work in the room. So we now have a dedicated plaque. It took quite a number of years, but we now have a special spot also in this room, which I think is amazing. So my presentation is based on different practices. So my practices as an interpreter, which is mainly in the European continent. So this is my experience, my context, and I know that's very different for you in Latin America. So things might not appeal to you, or I think that's very different. So feel free to discuss that with me later. How do we do it? How do you do it? Because I always like to learn how you do different things that I can then take on again. So we have actually in the European continent, we have 28 national sign languages on quite a small geographical area. So in the European Union, there are 28 national sign languages. So that's quite a lot. And what you can see here is one of my all-time favorite events. This is the European Parliament in Brussels. We have a parliament in Strasbourg. This is the sign, by the way, Strasbourg. Strasbourg in France. So the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and you have the European Parliament in Brussels. This was in 2016. And what made this event so special is that we had at that time, because the UK was still a member of the EU, we had a total of 31 different national sign language interpreters working in the parliament. So you can see them all standing up here in black. And for this event in the hemicycle, they have built these special steps, so we would be a bit higher standing, because otherwise if you're too low, then the people who are sitting in the audience couldn't see the interpreter. So they made 31 of those beautiful steps, and they made them. And so you see them all standing there, and all the national organizations, the deaf from all across Europe came, and they sat in their dedicated sections. And you can see in front is my name, and I was one of the panelists for one of the presentations. And you can see also interpreters working in the front. So they are actually looking towards us because they're working into a signed language. And we were all asked to present in our native language. So I presented in Dutch, and they presented in all different kinds of languages. And so all in all, so what you see here is the 28, no, at that time, 31 national sign languages, and also the 24 spoken languages, which are officially in the European Union. So we have 24 of them. And in total at that event, and that was the top ever that has been achieved, were 145 interpreters working at the same time. So I think I had to share this with you because this is a unique event. And this was organized at that time by the member of the European Parliament, Helga Stevens, who was one of the deaf members. We've had over the years several deaf members of the European Parliament, and this was Helga Stevens. And she organized this event because she wanted to draw attention to proposing a resolution where the European Union would say all national sign languages deserve equal recognition to spoken languages. So this, and then the second part was to recognize sign language interpreting as a profession. This was very important for her. So this was that event. Here, I wanted to show you, because we're talking about signed and spoken language interpreters, this is from the spoken language interpreter booth. So this is their view, how they could see everyone standing, and you can see all the deaf participants sitting. And now you can also see across all the booth of the spoken language interpreters. So there are 2 rows actually of spoken language interpreters going all around. So there are 2 levels of where they work. So my European perspective, my practitioner experience, this is what I will present to you in this presentation. And at the same time, I will also present from my PhD research, because my PhD research was about international sign conference interpreting. And in this research, I looked at the perspective of international sign interpreters on their practices. So what they thought, what they were doing in international sign. And because it was a PhD research, I didn't only look at international sign, but I looked at conference interpreting in general as a profession, and then making comparisons between spoken language interpreters, sign language interpreters, national sign language interpreters, and international sign interpreters. So 3 categories. So I'll share some of those findings with you as well. Okay. Yeah, the last thing I wanted to say about this, in this whole PhD research, which took 5 years, which was part-time, self-funded, and I wasn't on a contract of a university. I just thought this was a good thing to do. I'm happy it's now 2024 and I can say, yes, I managed. But overall, the research participants, so I got a total of 135 worldwide interpreters who work with international sign as one of their languages. So their perspectives are all in this PhD thesis or dissertation. Okay, so I want to also hear a little bit from you and your perspective. So I have started up a Slido, and I want you to join us with this Slido. And I think Fernanda is going to join the link. You can also do a QR screenshot with your mobile phone. You can also go to slido.com and type in the code, however you want to do it. So I'll give you a minute to get that up.
Olha, aqui está o link, gente, por favor. Ou então, como ela falou, pode usar o QR Code e o código para acesso está ali também.
Just waiting a second. Okay. So I will give you some questions during this presentation. And what I wanted to ask you first is this question. So second, it's starting up. If you can answer in Slido, it should pop up on your screen, this question. And I'll share soon the results. You won't see them till you have answered. And I apologize for the English. I'll read out the question, so it's also interpreted into Portuguese and into Libras. So the question is, what is your main profession? So the choices are spoken language interpreter, signed language interpreter, translator, and then the fourth is trainer / professor / teacher, and the fifth one is other. So here we can see who's participating. So it's nice to see that we have quite a different variety, but most of you are spoken language interpreters. So it's nice to know who I'm talking to as well. All right, let me go on. Then I wanted to know one more question from you. So the question is, which city and or country, well, country I think is obvious, but you never know who's snuck in here as well, are you from? Nice, thank you. I think everyone, no, someone's still typing. I can see that you're still typing, so I'm waiting a second. Thank you. So the biggest one is Sao Paulo, I see. That's where I used to live. Well, coincidence, great. Nice. Just go on. So the title of my presentation is Mixing It Up. The ideas of conference and signed and spoken language interpreters. How do we work together? What are the collaborative practices? What are the possibilities? What can we think about how to make this work together? Because I will look in this lecture specifically at conference interpreting, right? So the settings of a conference interpreter and how spoken and sign language interpreters can work together. There are different settings that we can think of, but specifically when we look at conferences, I think it's interesting to see and at what is already out there. So this is one of the definitions that AIIC gives of conference interpreting. Yeah, I'll read it out. Conference interpretation is conveying a message spoken or signed in one language into another. It is practiced at international summits, professional seminars, and bilateral and multilateral meetings of heads of state and government. Now, the interesting thing is, in my literature that I studied for all these years in my PhD, there's no agreement on what conference interpreting is. So this is one of the definitions. But if we look, for example, at the development of ISO standards, they've had a very, very hard time of defining what is a conference. Because there's so many different perspectives, it's influenced by cultures, by different practices. So this is one of them, but no one agrees on one definition. So I think it's good to keep this in mind. The other thing is, you see there's an underlined word or two words which says or signed on screen in the second sentence. And that's actually an addition, because the original definition by AIIC of conference interpreting did not include or signed. You have to keep in mind that in AIIC, sign language interpreters did not join till 2012, or actually they were allowed to join as of 2012. And then from 2014 on, more and more interpreters have joined, and I think we're nearly 50 sign language interpreters now who are either pre-candidate, full member, or candidate at this moment within AIIC. Now, if we look at spoken and signed languages, I think this is something to keep in mind. They're very different, right? In that sense, as spoken languages are produced orally, signed languages are produced manually. There's a lot on the face, on the body. So it's a 3D language when you talk about signed languages. And what we see in history is, as conference interpreting out there in the world globally, it's becoming more and more a practice that you see signed and spoken language interpreters working together. Now, the challenging part with getting signed languages included in general practices of conferences is that you have to deal with minority languages, and you have to often convince conference organizers that for a minority language, it doesn't matter how many people are participating, you will still need to provide this access. Minority languages also have often the case that it is well known what they are. So for example, with sign languages, I think one of the most frequent asked questions that we get is sign language a universal language? I think this is a question I've answered in my career over, I don't know, hundreds of times, because it's assumed that sign language is general, universal for everyone. Also, as a consultant, I get often asked, can you provide sign language interpreting services? Not specifying what language, what sign language, what the spoken language is, or vice versa. So traditionally, conference sign language interpreters, they have been trained to work between a national sign language and a spoken language. That's their setting, right? Or a written language. And so when they move on in their career, that goes for any interpreters, we tend to add languages, or we want to add languages. Now, one of the languages that we see more and more in international settings is international sign. Now, I think Brazil is an absolute phenomenon. In that sense, is there many, many deaf and hearing people who know international sign. And international sign is used quite frequently in different conference settings. So that's pretty amazing. If you look all over the world, this doesn't happen at all. Even in Europe, this is not a go-to provision to have international sign. So this is the challenge, is because there's little known still about international sign. And this is also why I wanted to do my research, is what do we actually do as international sign interpreters? What is that we do differently from national sign languages and from spoken language interpreters? And the results, so we do something different. Now, the thing is, international sign is, the normal path is that you first have a national sign language and then you add international sign. So it's not very common that anyone has international sign as their first signed language, because they build upon the foundations of a sign language. So the grammar of different sign languages, the knowledge of different sign languages, how deaf people in international contexts communicate with each other. So this is very specific to international sign. Now, what you see is the change is that IS is becoming more and more, how would you say, it's has more standardized lexicon, more and more in certain contexts. So when we look at international organizations and institutions, you see that the lexicon in International Sign is becoming very specific in certain settings. And that's interesting because International Sign doesn't tend to have a large lexicon compared to national sign languages. And this makes International Sign interpreting so special is because we have to work with concepts. We unpack concepts in different ways of signing. We use the signing space. We use more signed concepts and embodiments of people. So there's a very different way of interpreting when you interpret International Sign. But what you see now is that international organizations or international events, they put International Sign interpreting more and more in place. And I think that's good to know also for you as spoken language interpreters, how that is generally the case and what is the trend that we see and how we can support.
Lembre-se de levar todos os seus pertences trazidos a bordo.
Sorry, Maya, go ahead.
Now, I want to give some examples because you can have different mixed teams of interpreters, right? So you can combine a spoken language with a national sign language interpreter team, or you can have national sign language interpreters with international sign interpreters. Any combination is possible. And what is very typical is that depending on the event, also depending who leads the event, is how the provision is provided. So here you see a picture of what we call a deaf-led event. So deaf people have organized this event. This is specifically in Hungary. This is the sign for Hungary. And what you see here on the screen on the left side is you see International Sign being produced. On the right screen, you see Hungarian Sign Language. In the middle, the lady in the orange jacket is producing New Zealand Sign Language. And she has in the front, she has an interpreter sitting who understands New Zealand Sign Language and then provides it into Danish Sign Language to the International Sign interpreter on screen, who then produces International Sign. Now, what you cannot see here is the spoken language interpreters. So there are spoken language interpreters in the booth interpreting between Hungarian and English. So this is very specific for this setting is how this is done. And you can see that it's also very visual, right? Anyone can sit anywhere in the room. You can see the screens or you can look at the people on stage. In addition to this is you can also see that there are live captions. So on the left side, International Sign in Europe tends to have English captions, live captions, and Hungarian has then Hungarian captions. Yeah, so you can use all different ways of looking at the input. Now you might wonder, why did you say that there's Danish Sign Language? Well, the interpreter on screen on the left side is deaf. So she's from Denmark and she has many working languages, but she works with a colleague from Denmark who understands New Zealand Sign Language, gives the relay to her in Danish Sign Language. She takes that and then produces International Sign. I'm just waiting. This is complicated to interpret into Libras, I know. Okay. All right, so this is a deaf-led event. I want to show you another picture. This is a hearing-led event. This happens to be in the European Commission. And what you see here is a colleague of mine who is interpreting, and in the back of her, she has a blue screen. This is also being streamed, live streamed on the web at the same time. And there's a camera on her and there's a deaf audience. So this becomes a bit tricky because for an interpreter to work and on the stream and for a deaf audience, you always have to see where your eye gaze goes. So this is something that we learn how to work with, because the moment we lose eye contact with our deaf audience, it loses meaning, or you get less audience feedback. When you only look in the camera, then you have no feedback at all. And the people who are watching in the stream, it's very awkward if the interpreter doesn't look at the camera. So you have to look kind of sideways, up and down, just to give that natural feeling. So this is in addition to the complexity as to how we have to work in live settings. Now, I have another question for you. How often do you work in a mixed team of signed and spoken language interpreters? Not everyone has answered yet. I'm looking at the number of people. You see me looking back and forth. I have 4 screens going on here. I'm just looking at what's happening. Okay. All right. So most of you sometimes work in a mixed team. Some never, and 8% regularly. Oh, here we go. Never and regularly is a tie. No? Okay. Now I have another question, and that's just for our sign language interpreter colleagues to answer. So if you're not a sign language interpreter, for the next question, don't answer it, okay? Spoken language interpreters come next. So first, sign language interpreters. So for sign language interpreters, did you complete a university degree program in conference interpreting? So specifically conference interpreting. So if you can answer that question, please. So if you're a sign language interpreter, did you have a degree, university degree in conference interpreting? Okay. I think we don't have many colleagues here, so I'm just waiting to see. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to the question for the spoken language interpreters. So did you complete a university degree in conference interpreting? And there's no right or wrong here. It's more to get an understanding of your profile. Okay, so you see a clear difference, even though the numbers are, of course, a bit different in this meeting, between how many signed and how many spoken language interpreters we have. But you can say that becoming a conference interpreter is very, very different for signed and spoken language interpreters. Because, you know, in order to work effectively together, I think it's good to know and take a look at the history of how signed and spoken language interpreters became professionals, how they were trained, how the profession developed, and what their current practices are. Yeah. So if we have that understanding, then we can also, you know, smoothly work together in our daily practice when we happen to work together. So if you look at interpreting at conferences, what we see is that the establishment of AIIC, which is in 1953, which is the International Association of Conference Interpreters, they aimed to professionalize the profession of conference interpreting, right? So they had trade union, they had professional standards, they really started to develop, and they worked on collective agreements, etc. So this is very typical for conference spoken language interpreters. Now we have spoken languages, we have national sign languages, but we also have international sign. So is this the same for all three? How that went, the profession and the training? What we see with spoken language interpreters is that often you are trained as a conference interpreter having already the linguistic skills. So you know the languages before you start to get trained in conference interpreting. Many times you see that you can have a degree in conference interpreting. We just saw that from you that you answered. You had a conference interpreting degree, the majority of you. You have professional organizations who were a long time ago established. You have accreditation tests for many of the international organizations. But you also learn in practice, right? So you might go through a training, but then in the end, to refine your skills, you would need to learn in practice. So this profession, if you look at the establishment of AIIC, has been there for, 60, 70 years. So the profession has had some time to get established. Now, if you look at national sign language interpreters, what we generally see globally is that students who enter that program usually do not know a signed language. So they don't know a sign, they learn actually during the training of interpreting what that signed language is. So I'm not speaking specifically about Brazil, but what we know about the world, and specifically about my research in Europe, most of the interpreters do not know a sign language. So they learn it as an L2 during their interpreter training program. They're also trained as community or dialogue interpreters. So not as conference interpreters. They have professional organizations not so long time ago established, and they also learn in practice. Now, if you look at international sign interpreters, that comes after all of what you've done as a national sign language interpreter. So it's after your education, after you have some experience working as a national sign language interpreter, and you learn IS by looking and doing. So there is no degree program in international sign or international sign interpreting. So it's very informal learning. There's no education, and community of practices of interpreters who have worked as international sign interpreters are crucial. So this is where you learn. Now, here we go with another question for you. What similarities do you see between signed and spoken language conference interpreters practices? So when you work together or not, what do you know about what is the same when you work between a signed and spoken language interpreter? What is the similarities in your practices? Feel free to also answer in Portuguese, if you're not comfortable in English. So this is fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing, your experiences and your views. And I see many similarities. So taking turns in the time that you work, the need to prepare, to understand, and preparation is indeed a very big thing. Now, what is interesting is that we see each other as interpreters, right? As spoken interpreters, spoken language interpreters, as sign language interpreters, as conference interpreters, you would think. Now, here is the interesting thing. That is still often not the case. So because of where sign language interpreters come from, generally, the community, educated in the community, they're not trained in general as conference interpreters. Many also don't view them as conference interpreters, even if their practice is conference interpreting. This was even, in 2018, this bad that AIIC decided to put a resolution forward to their assembly, which stated, just to remind everyone, that sign and spoken language interpreters are all conference interpreters. Because even not anymore on a daily basis, but weekly basis, I still have to argue with many people that we are also conference interpreters. So this is a struggle, and it's also a struggle, then it has a consequence as to how our work is valued. Now, the next question I have for you, you might expect this already, is what differences do you see between signed and spoken language conference interpreter practices? I have to smile. There's the one with spoken language interpreters get to hide most of the time. I like that one. Yes, visibility is a very, very big thing in sign language interpreting. We can't hide, we can't look at our papers at the same time. We therefore also very much depend on teams. How we work together is absolutely crucial, and we need that team support. Especially in conference settings. So again, there are definitely similarities, but there are quite a number of differences, and that's okay. But I think why I want to bring this up is it's good to be aware of these differences so we can support each other in our work, and how spoken language interpreters can support sign language interpreters and vice versa. That's the idea. So let me go on. So what the differences in the requirements is also really important in the whole argumentation when you put these teams together, because it's the value that we put on spoken and sign language interpreting. So the professional standards, the working conditions, and what is often the case is because there is a specific international organization in conference interpreting who has standards, and there are very few sign language interpreters still a member of that. The awareness among sign language interpreters, but also the awareness among spoken language interpreters is still low. So we need to make sure that what we know, what we learned, is to further the profession, is share that knowledge with each other. And so often we as sign language interpreters are also asked as experts, which makes it an ethical issue, because are we supposed to answer questions from the organizers, or should we actually refer to the deaf person? The deaf person would love to answer, but the deaf people often get over asked. They just want to go to a conference and sit and also enjoy the conference as participants and not have all the questions. How should we do this? How should we do that? So often that comes then to the sign language interpreting team to explain, set everything up. That's an extra burden because it's not always natural and in place already by conference organizers. Here you see also one picture of, is actually a European Commission event, just to give you some ideas of how things are set up. So we are either working on site like this, where you see the screen on the floor, you see the person standing there. We have spoken language interpreters in the back in the booth. But the moment that there are deaf people on site in these conferences, we are also doing the whole liaison interpreting, the network interpreting. We're also being streamed live with, you know, our face, our hands, everything. So there are lots of additions that come to sign language interpreters. The other thing that we have taught each other here in the EU context is that we always go and meet the spoken language colleagues. That's not always something that has been done. So it's really important to meet each other, to know who you're working with, and share, for example, terminology. How the interpreters did for this meeting as well. Before we started, you know, they shared terminology. How would you say that? How do you sign that? It's very important to share that because that is shared knowledge. And not everyone does that in all the meetings that I have been to. So it's kind of modeling what we need is also important. This is quite a new setup. This is in the European Commission in the press room. And we have very much lobbied to be there with all our spoken language colleagues. You can see them sitting up in the booth. You see the screen with all the languages. And in front of my colleague, you see that we have in place that we have all the visuals. So we can see actually the commissioner who's standing also next to us. We can see ourselves. We can see also the names that we've typed in beforehand, so we know who is talking now. And on the bottom left, we can also have, then if someone connects remotely, like a journalist, we will see him on screen there. Okay, I'm just checking. I'm checking for time, and I'm checking for everything that I still want to share with you, but let me go on. Here's another example from the spoken language interpreter booth. So here we are actually seen on a live big screen. This was during COVID. No one in the room, but all the spoken language interpreters were on site. We could not travel, so we were in Zoom, and then we are also displayed on the screen in the booth for the spoken language interpreters, and you see us there as well. And so that's really important to think about who is part of the team, how do we share, and one of the essential things that we also tend to say is that when we as sign language interpreters can't see what's happening, descriptive ways of describing what is there or who is speaking is very helpful. So if someone is taking turns, or you are interpreting as spoken language interpreters to people who are in dialogue, we need to know who's speaking when. Now, this is very special. This is a sign language booth at the United Nations in Geneva, which was especially built at the renovations. So you can see us here in the booth working, but you also see us in the conference room. So we're projected, and the colleague in front can see in the conference room, and the colleague who is actively interpreting sees everything on screen, including the live captions. Now, this is another remote setup where you can see we're all working together, and we have preparation, we have the screens, who is doing what, all the visual input that we can get. Now, what should we do next with everything that we know now? So I am a strong believer in shared knowledge, in sharing practices, sharing how we further the profession as conference interpreting together. So one of the things that I do now, or I have been appointed at, is this, and you might have heard about this, it was already mentioned in the introduction, is namely a new ISO standard that will be developed specifically on interpreters' working environment. Now, the interesting thing is this is part of a series of 1, 2, 3. This is number 4. The first 3 is also about interpreting, conference interpreting, and they call it simultaneous interpreting. Now, sign language interpreters usually work in simultaneous mode, in exceptional settings not. This is about recommendations, requirements in conference settings for sign language interpreters. So this is about to happen, and we need colleagues from Brazil to also join this work, because we think it's very important that we have signed and spoken language perspectives and experiences. So I just wanted to give a little highlight to this so we don't forget. Now, I've actually come to the end of my presentation and my screenshot of me working in the booth. I hope it gave you a bit of an impression of, summary of my practices, my research. But with that, I also want to ask you the last question. Namely, what will you focus on next time you work in a mixed team? This is really great. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your perspectives. And I know I've talked too long, and I hope you felt also participatory in this presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen soon, and I want to thank the organizers again, the interpreters again, your participation, and I'm happy to stay and answer any questions and have a discussion. Here's some references still. I'll leave them not now, but you can read them later. These are just some food for thought. And my web address, if you want to find any of these articles, they're all on my website, so you can find them there. All right, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much. We'll now have some time for questions and answers and discussion. We'd like to thank you very much for the presentation, but I'll stop recording now, okay?